At Lake Woods Drive last week, we were in Hebrews chapter 3 in our auditorium class, and I said that I had some thoughts about Exodus chapter 15 that I would share if I had opportunity, and now we're taking the opportunity to do exactly that. Hebrews chapter 3 contains a several verse-long quotation from Psalm 95, which itself refers back to the incidents in the wilderness, and particularly Exodus chapter 15, right after the Red Sea delivery. And the idea of the God who fixes problems, the God who is a positive force in the life of his people, is a very important theme that sometimes gets lost. The Hebrew writer is trying to emphasize that. I'm going to try to be emphasizing that today. God calls himself here YHWY Rapha, the God who heals you. And that's the thought that I want to kind of pursue a little bit, and how exactly God pursues healing in the life of his people, starting here in Exodus chapter 15 and going on through our lives also as we kind of wander in the wilderness as well. Oftentimes in our hymns and in other places as well, we see a parallel between the 40 years in the wilderness that the Israelites went through, waiting for their entry into the promised land, and our own wanderings for 70 or 80 years, waiting for our entry into heaven. That's the point that Hebrews is making in chapter 3 and chapter 4, this rest that remains for the people of God. That's what we're looking forward to. And in the meantime, we need help. We need water. We need food. We need some kind of encouragement, a helping hand, if you will, to deal with life's adversities, which are real and which are distracting and which can interfere materially with our ability to serve God in this life. They don't have to. God doesn't want them to. And with faith and with more confidence in God and his power, we can endure such things. And that's what we're going to be focusing on here a little bit today. Read with me, if you would, in Exodus chapter 15, starting verse 22. Then Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea. This is after the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of Pharaoh's armies. And they went out from the wilderness to the wilderness of Shur. They journeyed for 3 days in the wilderness without finding water. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. That's why it was named Marah. The people grumbled to Moses, "What are we going to drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he threw it into the water, the water became drinkable. The Lord made a statute and ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. He said, "If you will carefully obey the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, pay attention to his commands, and keep all his statutes, I will not inflict any illnesses on you that I inflicted upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 date palms, and they camped there by the water. It's probably worth noting here that the overwhelming body of work that God has done with regard to his people, at least in this generation, has been what you might call of a negative nature. He sent plagues upon Egypt, and the people of God suffered from some of those, at least temporarily. And then, of course, there is the destruction of the firstborn of Egypt, and there is the parting of the Red Sea. And although that's a positive thing, obviously, for the Israelites, it is most noteworthy, perhaps even more than delivery of the people, the destruction of Egypt. This grand victory that God is able to work in them by destroying their enemies. And if we're not careful at this point, if we're in the position of the people of God, it might be our tendency to think that God is simply a destroyer. God is someone who breaks things. God is vengeful. God is wrathful. God does bad, evil, horrible things, or at least maybe not evil, but horrible things. And our job is to stay on the right side of his wrath. And there's certainly there's nothing wrong with that point of view. You ought to fear the Lord. You ought to quake in his presence. You ought to make sure that you do not offend him. But that's not the only way that God appeals to his people. And it's very important that we realize this. And God emphasizes this to the Israelites at the very first opportunity here. I am YHWY Rapha, he says. I'm the God who heals, not just the God who destroys or breaks or kills. I'm the one who heals. And it's very important that the people of God in general and the people of God in the wilderness in particular start looking to God as someone who fixes problems instead of simply creating problems for bad people. He is not the problem. He is the solution. There's a great passage given to us in Psalm 103, I believe it is. Psalm 103 in verses 1 through 5. attributed to David. The psalm reads like this: "My soul, bless the Lord, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. My soul, bless the Lord, and do not forget all his benefits. He forgives all your iniquity. He heals all your diseases. He redeems your life from the pit. He crowns you with faithful love and compassion. He satisfies you with good things. Your youth is renewed like the evil." Reading from the CSB today. I love the verbs that he chooses here, these active, powerful, positive verbs. He forgives, he heals, he redeems, he crowns, he satisfies. This is a loving, benevolent God that we're looking at here. I don't want you to be thirsty in the wilderness. Yes, there is a sense in which I will test you. I will put you through hardships, if you will. More on that in a second. But this is so that you can see me coming to your rescue. This is so that you can see me blessing you in a way that makes no sense. It has to come from God, because this is not the way you fix bitter water, alkaline water, by throwing a tree in it. That doesn't make any sense. But God is able to do it this way because he is the one who heals. And I think it's important for us to look at God in this way. If the only way that you look at God is someone who will send you to hell if you don't get baptized in water, and as a result, you're going to make sure you get baptized in water, that's fine as far as that goes. But at some point, you need to realize that God is much, much more than that. If you somehow manage to cross through the Red Sea and not get killed, good for you. You ought to do that. We'll talk about being baptized into Moses here in a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. But wouldn't it be better if you saw this positive aspect to God, if you saw him blessing you, not just in heaven, but blessing you now, giving you comfort and peace and joy and satisfaction and purpose and value? The idea that you are important to him, important enough for him to send his son to die on the cross for you. He is not the problem that we somehow need to avoid. He is the solution to our problems. Now, ironically, in a twisted sort of way, I guess you might say, the problems that we have that he's able to get us past are problems, at the very least, of his permission, and sometimes, it seems at least, problems of his making. And that's what brings us to chapter 16 in Exodus here, and the reference that Moses makes to it in Deuteronomy chapter 8. In chapter 16 of Exodus, verse 1, we read, "The entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we had sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us to this wilderness to make the whole assembly die of hunger." If God had wanted to kill us, why didn't he kill us when we weren't hungry? Why did we have to go through all this mess and then have him kill us? The point seems to be, again, forgetting the point. And allow me to back up a little bit with regard to this, and not necessarily excuse the Israelites, but put their failure of faith in context. This is a generation that didn't know anything about God, that in many aspects had not heard of God. Remember, Moses wasn't sure that people were going to know what God he was talking about when he went back to Egypt at the burning bush there. What God am I going to say is delivering them? These people are not acquainted with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Most of them, at least, are not. And so it's difficult for them to learn. The first chapter, rather the 15th chapter, that first incident that we get after the Red Sea, there's not any chastening really from God. They don't have any water. They're complaining to Moses, and by extension, complaining to God. But this is an opportunity for healing. This is an opportunity for education. This is who I am. Well, here we are a little bit farther down the road, and we're complaining again. And you're going to see that God's attitude is going to change somewhat toward the people as the complaining continues and increases, even after one delivery after another. They're in the wilderness. Anyway, here they don't have any food, and so they are asking him to deliver them. And chapter 8 of Deuteronomy, Moses puts it this way. I like the first 3 verses here. "Carefully follow every command I'm giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and take possession of the land the Lord swore to your fathers. Remember that the Lord your God led you on the entire journey these 40 years in the wilderness, so that he might humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments, his commands. He humbled you by letting you go hungry. Then he gave you manna to eat, which you and your fathers had not known, so that you might learn that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Now, you may be inserting here on the topic of testing here. Hal, you just said that he wasn't the problem, he was the solution. And the text says here that he deliberately let them be hungry. Well, that's the problem, and the problem came from God. At least after a fashion, it came from God. It certainly could have been avoided if God had wanted to do that. And this is yet another opportunity for me to talk about not but phrases. Here I'm using one. We don't use this quite as much in English, perhaps, as the Bible does, but they're all over the Bible, and it's not difficult to understand what the Bible's trying to say when Jesus says, for instance, don't work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life. We understand what he means by that. Working for food is not only a good thing, it's a needful thing. People will go to hell, I'm gathering, because they did not work for food. The one who doesn't provide for his family is worse than an infidel, Paul writes. The point that Jesus is making is that laboring for spiritual food is far more important than laboring for physical food. He is de-emphasizing the one aspect so that he can re-emphasize and extra emphasize the second aspect. And that's the point here. It's not that God does not allow or even create issues in our life that will be a hardship. The point is that the blessings that come because of such things are far greater than any kind of problem or so-called problem we might encounter in this life. He allows the testing. He didn't have to do that, obviously, and you may have wondered about that over the years. Why is it God allowed me to lose my job or allowed my family to fall apart, or why does he not heal me of this illness or whatever? And I don't have answers for it, not specific answers anyway for that. I do have a general answer. The general answer is always the same. It is so that you can lean on the Lord a little bit more, just like the thorn in the flesh that Paul wrestles with in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. This effectively serves as an opportunity for him to increase his faith and increase his dependence on Jesus. Now, there may be more to it than that. I wouldn't be able to say, even if I knew your specific situation, I probably wouldn't be able to say, nor even for my own sake. But at least there's that. And by faith, we accept that whatever circumstance God sees fit to allow in our life or send into our life, this is going to work his good in us. All things come together for good. Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. That's what he means there, that the circumstances of this life are all intended to help us lean on the Lord a little bit more, for us to build our faith, for us to build our hope, build our connection to God. Now, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but it's not because God failed somehow or because he chose a bad road for us to walk down. It's that we chose not to walk down that road or not walk down that road very effectively. The solutions that he offers in our lives do include problems from time to time. And I can't, again, speak to the specifics of your life, but whatever you're wrestling with, whatever you're going through right now, maybe you're blaming God for that. Maybe you're crying out to God day after day, hour after hour, and still nothing comes back. Whatever the response comes or does not come from God, whatever you're looking for, whatever you're hoping for, whatever you're getting or not getting, realize that God is going to carry you through this. There is an indefinite amount of time, an indefinite amount of suffering, of hardship that you're going to be required to endure. I don't know how much of it there is. I don't know what the maximum limit is. I don't know what the time frame God has in mind is, if he has a time frame in mind. But I do know this. The 40 years will run out one of these days. And if you are found faithful, he will carry you into the promised land. This is his ultimate solution, not to remove the problems of the wilderness, but to get you out of the wilderness. And it's just vitally important that we remember that. It's not that God doesn't care about our sufferings here, or that God wants us to be in pain here. It's all about the next step for God. And oftentimes it's not about the next step for us. We think the idea of rest that we're looking for is rest from our problems, rest from our difficulties, hardships, pain and suffering and all that kind of thing. And we want that rest right now. Well, we're not likely to get the rest right now. And we're certainly not going to get all of it. Not in this life. God asks us to wait and to trust in him. And in the meantime, to look to the rock of our salvation. And there's an interesting play on words that we get in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, with regard to this idea of the rock, and a couple of incidents that it calls to mind when we're looking at the life of Moses and the life of the Israelites in the wilderness. In the next chapter, in Exodus chapter 17, we see the entire Israelite community, verse 1, left the wilderness of sin, moving from one place to the next according to the Lord's command. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink, so the people complained to Moses, "Give us water to drink." Here we go again, right? They still haven't learned the lesson. "Why are you complaining to me?" Moses replied to them. "Why are you testing the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water and grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you ever bring us up from Egypt to kill us with our children and our livestock with thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What should I do with these people? In a little while they will stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take the staff that you struck the Nile with in your hand and go. I'm going to stand there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. When you hit the rock, water will come out from it, and the people will drink." Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. He named the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites complained and because they tested the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not?" I love this idea of testing the Lord. We were just talking about the Lord testing the Israelites in the wilderness in Deuteronomy chapter 8. This is alluded to in Psalm 95 and through quotation in Hebrews chapter 3 as well, which is what prompted this entire lesson in my mind. How can it be that we turn this around and turn a testing of our own hearts from God into us testing the Lord? Psalm 95 talks about it that way. This passage talks about it also in verse number 2. Why are you testing the Lord? And we're guilty of this sometimes. We fear that, or we would suggest, we infer that if the Lord does not hop to it on our schedule, if he does not answer our requests in the way that we want them answered, well, somehow God's not real. God's not loving. God's not powerful, or whatever conclusion we want to come to here. I'm certainly not going to serve God because he's not doing what I told him to do. Well, that's a silly position to take if you understand the proper relationship between master and servant. We are serving him. It's his job to test us, not vice versa. It would be kind of like the showing up for calculus class on day one and us giving a test to the teacher. We're not quite sure that you're qualified to be a teacher. And so we're going to ask you some questions here about how you would respond in this situation and that situation. We're going to talk to you about what proper treatment is and how much homework is appropriate and grading curves and all that kind of thing. And if you pass muster, if you answer the questions like we think they ought to be answered, then we'll go ahead and sit in calculus class. Well, I certainly hope that's not the way that it works. That's the inmates running the asylum, you might say. And it's certainly not the way it works with God. We don't test God. God tests us. He is the one with the answers. He is the one who knows the finish line, how we're supposed to turn out, what the end product is supposed to look like. That's not our job. We don't know those things. We're not expected to know those things. We sometimes convince ourselves that we do. The end product is for us to be happy and comfortable and a whole lot of money and die in our beds when we're 150 or whatever happens. No, that's not the way that it works. God has the end in mind. And he has, by the way, far greater things in mind for us than we ever could have imagined for ourselves. That's what the text tells us to imagine by faith. But we're only going to get there if we go to the rock. And there's another passage, of course, that's as familiar or more familiar, where Moses is told to speak to the rock and he strikes the rock instead. We're not going to get into fits of anger and that sort of thing here today. But the point being that there is a rock in the wilderness. There is strength. There is refuge. There is hope that is available to us. That seems to be the point, at least in part, when Paul refers to this incident in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Going back to verse number 1, Paul writes here, "Now I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate from the same spiritual food," that's the manna, of course, "and they all drank from the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." Now, there are a lot of ways in which people will try to make specific applications of this, whether this river that came from the rock actually followed the people along the way or what have you. The spiritual point, the broader point, is much more important. That's what we want to emphasize here. That rock was Christ. And again, there are several ways of looking at that, but my takeaway from it is this. that when we look at the rock, when we look at God's provision for his people in the wilderness, we look at the source of refreshment and comfort and hope and faith that God gave them in the wilderness in abundance to them and their flocks. This is a foretaste of how Jesus is going to interact with us. That rock was Christ in the sense that it is a forerunner. It is an antitype, or a type rather, of Jesus. Jesus is going to be our rock in our wanderings in the wilderness. And God has struck him. God has beaten him. God has made him flow in the most literal of senses. And the blood and the water that came out of the side of Jesus at the cross spiritually stands for refreshment and healing and life itself that flows from Jesus to us every single day in the wilderness. That rock is Christ. And when we put confidence in God, we put confidence in his provision for us, we have this assurance that it's going to be okay for us. We're going to look to where salvation comes from. We're going to look to where refreshment comes from. Jesus talked to the woman at the well in John chapter 4 about this well that was going to spring up in the heart of believers, resulting in eternal life. That's what he does if we walk by faith, if we trust that his way and his path and his plan is sufficient. You may or may not be able to make sense of it in any given moment in time, but that doesn't mean it's not real. That doesn't mean God is asleep at the switch somehow. I'm sure there are many, many moments in the wilderness, we read about several of them, where individual people or virtually the entire congregation lost their way, lost their faith. We want to go back. This was a mistake. We never should have started here in the first place. And there may be times in your life when you're that way as well. That's when you need to look to the rock. That's when you need to look to Jesus. And remember, there are bigger things going on than you can possibly imagine. God is wiser than we are. He is able to see ahead and know what we really need, not what we think we need, but what we really need. And all of it, going back to our original point, is intended to heal you, not heal you of your momentary hardships and difficulties, although there's some of that. The main thing is to heal you from the spiritual pain and anguish that you're in a world that is sin-stained and sin-spoiled. It's never going to be what it ought to be in this life, no matter how wonderful, no matter how much faith you have, no matter how good your surroundings are, no matter how much spiritual family you have and how many spiritual blessings you have and physical blessings and all the rest. You're never going to have the full rest that God has in mind for you in this life. It's not his plan to do that. And part of the reason he withholds some of those things from us is so that we will anticipate the day that we will cross over Jordan and receive the full inheritance, the full rest that he has in mind for us. In the meantime, welcome the healing that Jesus offers to you. Welcome the healing that God has for you in the wilderness, and find contentment in that, find purpose in that, and find refreshment in that, so you can go out into the world and serve the purposes that God has for you while time still stands for you here in this life. I hope that this is a blessing for you. I hope that this encourages you in the wilderness, and that you'll be strengthened and emboldened to walk with Christ more perfectly. Thank you very much for tuning in. God bless.